Russia never been a big market for video game consoles. In the early 1980s, the only ones available were either at the arcade in a very simple and basic level or at home, mostly cloned of the Nintendo Game Watch by the quite famous company Electronica. Other popular systems were clones of the ZX Spectrum. Most of them kept the original keyboard, but you could have a version made like a joystick more similar to other video game consoles based on Western clones. But this video isn't about those consoles, it's about their successor called Dendy, the most iconic video game console in Russian history. While it's technically a Famicom and a licensed hardware clone of the Nintendo Famicom, the Japanese version of the NES, it became so popular that Dendy became the generic word for any video game console in the post-Soviet era. The early 1990s were a hard time for Russia. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a fast conversion from communist economy to capitalist economy. So few very rich people bought big sectors of the economy, becoming very rich. This is also similar to how Stifler, the parent company of Dendy, became so wealthy. So in the early 90s, after the collapse of the USSR, Western and Japanese consoles like the NES or Sega Genesis were practically non-existent or prohibitively expensive in Russia. Seeing a massive gap in the market, a Russian company called Stifler, founded by Viktor Saryuk, a Russian graduate from University of Technology Informatics, decided to import Taiwanese hardware clones of the Famicom. Before stepping foot into the video game console market with the Dendy in 1992, Stifler was already a company founded by Viktor Saryuk that was in charge of doing some works for the Russian government and IT industries, for example, translating Windows 3.1 to Russian and other jobs related to banking internet security. The hardware was produced in Taiwan using Chinese components but branded and marketed exclusively for the Russian community of independent states market by Stifler. The mascot was a small elephant wearing a red cap designed by Russian animator Ivan Maximov. The two major models, Dendy Classic based on the original Taiwanese Micro Genius design. It had a sleek, rounded look and was generally of higher build quality. Dendy Jr., the budget version that looked almost identical to the original Japanese Nintendo Famicom. This version became the most common in Russian households. And then the third version, especially popular in Moldova, it was keyboard-shaped with, aside from games, also the original cartridge made for educational software. Dendy wasn't just a console, it was a brand, a media phenomenon. Stifler invested heavily in advertising, with the catchy slogan, Dendy, Dendy, we all love Dendy. Dendy everyone plays. There was also a TV show from 1994 to 1996 called Dendy the New Reality, hosted by Sergei Supronev, aired on national television. It was the first time millions of kids saw video game review, tips and gameplay, turning gaming into a massive subculture overnight. Aside from these, there were also many popular magazines that talked about Dendy and its various games, for example, sometimes pirated games or also hacks or other games. Since Dendy used 60-pin Famicom style cartridge, the market was flooded with multicars, For example, 999 games in one, often featuring bizarre bootlegs such as Somari, Mario in Sonic's Void, or Super Mario 14 and others. While Dendy played Famicom games, it was built on PAL Secam televisions. Clock speed ran slightly slower than the original NTSC Famicom 1.77 MHz versus 1.79 MHz because it ran at PAL 50 Hz instead of North American 60 Hz. Interestingly, the Dendy used this specific mode that was a mix of PAL 50 Hz refresh rate but with a CPU timing closer to NTSC. This created a quite unique standard. Around 1994, Nintendo understood their situation. In a bizarre twist of business, Stifler actually signed an official agreement with Nintendo in the year 1994. Since Nintendo had no distribution network in Russia, they essentially forgave Stifler for the poverty Dendy in exchange for Stifler becoming the official distributor of Super Nintendo and Game Boy in the region. Before the deal in 1994, Stifler was a general electronic giant. They didn't just sell the Dendy Famicom clone, but they also sold Mega Drive clones imported from Asia and other Sega clones. At the time, they were selling about 4,000 Sega clones and over 100,000 Dendy clones. Nintendo was aggressive about its intellectual property, but they realized that they couldn't realistically sue a Russian company in a post-Soviet legal vacuum. So they took the approach: if you can't beat them, buy them and ally with them. So in November 1994, Stifler and Nintendo reached an agreement. Nintendo would ignore the fact that Dendy was a powered clone and wouldn't sue Stifler. But in exchange, Stifler was granted exclusive rights to distribute the Super Nintendo and Game Boy in Russia and CIS market. But Stifler was strictly forbidden from promoting or selling Sega products in their specialized Dendy retail stores. So what did Stifler do? Technically, in the Dendy stores, they didn't sell Sega clones to make Nintendo happy. But as a company, they tried to keep a foot in both camps. While the Dendy division was exclusive to Nintendo, Stifler briefly tried to make a subsidiary to sell all the non-Nintendo gaming and Sega clones, but the internal conflict and the pressure from Nintendo made it more difficult. Why this backfired? The peace treaty with Nintendo actually contributed to Stifler's eventual downfall. The main reason was price shock. Official Nintendo SNES console and cartridge were incredibly expensive compared to the pirated Dendies. Most Russians simply couldn't afford a more than $100 console and $50 games in 1995. The Sega vacuum. By forcing Stifler to stop pushing Sega, Nintendo inadvertently left the door open for other distributors to flood the market with cheap Sega Mega Drive clones, or just generic Sega clones. So, the clash between the high cost of official Nintendo and very shady banking collapse in Russia, other distributors that sold Sega Genesis clones cheaper than the Nintendo SNES made Stifler going into bankruptcy near 1996.